They thought they could sneak into his pool whenever they wanted, until they walked out glowing like human highlighters. David never thought his biggest headache as a homeowner would be his own backyard. He'd spent years saving up for a house with a pool, a place to unwind after work, host barbecues, and enjoy Arizona's sweltering summers. But lately, something felt off. At first, he dismissed it. A few wet footprints on the pavement, but no rain in sight. The faint scent of chlorine, even on days he hadn't been outside. Then came the noises, soft splashes at night, like someone slipping into the water when the world was quiet. He convinced himself it was nothing, maybe a stray cat, maybe his mind playing tricks on him. But doubt started nagging at him. One evening, David stayed up later than usual, watching a movie in the living room. Around 11 p.m., he muted the TV and listened. Nothing, just the faint hum of the pool pump outside. He exhaled, feeling ridiculous. Then he heard it, a laugh. Not his, not from his TV. It was coming from the backyard. David's pulse kicked up. He reached for his phone and, moving carefully, crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. His jaw tightened. Silhouettes moving. Someone was out there. He almost yanked open the back door and stormed outside, but he stopped himself. If they were bold enough to break into his backyard, they might be just as bold in how they reacted. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted proof. The next morning, David installed security cameras, small, barely noticeable, but with a perfect view of the pool. If someone was trespassing, he'd catch them in the act, and what he found made his blood boil. David didn't have to wait long. The following morning, he checked the security footage while sipping his coffee, expecting to see maybe a few raccoons scurrying around. What he saw instead made him tighten his grip on the mug. There they were, Mark and Lisa, his next-door neighbors, along with their 2 teenage sons and a couple of their friends, lounging in his pool like they owned the place. The video showed them slipping in through his side gate, which David usually kept locked. Except he realized now that the latch was slightly bent, probably from repeated forced entries. The group was laughing, splashing around, and sipping drinks, like they were at some kind of private resort. His private resort. David scrubbed through the footage, his anger growing. This wasn't a one-time thing. The timestamps showed them sneaking in multiple times over the past 2 weeks, late at night while he was sleeping or out. They weren't just taking quick dips, they were throwing full-blown pool parties. He stared at the screen, jaw clenched. The audacity! They never asked, never mentioned a word about it in passing, just assumed they could help themselves. David played back a clip from 2 nights ago. The teenagers were cannonballing into the deep end, while Mark lounged on one of David's pool floats, sipping what looked like a beer. Lisa sat on the edge, dipping her feet in, chatting loudly. At one point, Mark even tossed an empty can onto David's patio. That was it. David had been patient, but this was beyond disrespectful. He could march over there right now, knock on their door, demand an explanation. But David wasn't interested in an argument. He wanted them to understand just how badly they had messed up. He scrolled through the footage one more time, shaking his head. They were so comfortable trespassing, so shameless, that they probably didn't think twice about it. That was going to change. David leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table. He could call the cops, but he wasn't looking to start some ugly neighborhood dispute. He could report them to the HOA, but that would take time, and he wanted immediate results. Then it hit him. Something from his college days, a prank his chemistry buddies used to pull on unsuspecting freshmen. Phosphorescent dye, completely invisible in daylight, but once it made contact with water, it clung to skin and fabric like glue, and under artificial light it glowed bright neon green. David smirked. He already knew exactly where to get it. David wasn't the kind of guy to let things slide, but he also wasn't looking for an all-out war with his neighbors. He wanted a lesson, Something harmless but humiliating enough to make them think twice before sneaking into his backyard again. So he went shopping. He found exactly what he needed at an online chemical supply store. Phosphorescent dye, the kind used in harmless pranks, but impossible to remove quickly. It was completely invisible in daylight and only revealed its full effect once exposed to artificial light after water activation. And the best part, it bonded to skin and fabric for up to 48 hours. David placed the order and waited. A few days later, the package arrived. That night, when the neighborhood had settled into silence, he got to work. He drained a portion of his pool, just enough to dilute the existing chemicals, then poured in the special dye. The water looked completely normal, no strange colors, no odors, nothing that would raise suspicion. David cleaned up and went inside, checking the time. If the pattern held, his uninvited guests would be here soon. And he wasn't wrong. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the security cameras picked up movement. The side gate creaked open. There they were, Mark, Lisa, and their usual crew, sneaking in like clockwork. David watched from his laptop, smirking as they made themselves comfortable. The teenagers jumped in first, splashing around. Lisa sat on the edge, laughing, while Mark did his usual beer-in-hand float routine. They had no idea. For the next 30 minutes, David let them enjoy themselves. He scrolled through his phone, keeping an eye on the footage, waiting for the moment of realization. Then it happened. One of the teenagers climbed out of the pool and reached for a towel. As he moved under the patio light, he froze. His arms, his legs, bright neon green. Lisa's son let out a panicked yell. Lisa turned her head. Her eyes went wide. "What the?" She looked down at her own arms. Same thing, a glowing, unnatural green creeping across her skin. The other teens scrambled out, screaming. Mark sat up on his float, confused, until he saw his reflection in the glass patio door. He was glowing. Full panic set in. One of the teens sprinted to the outdoor shower, furiously scrubbing his arms, but the color wasn't coming off. Lisa grabbed a towel, rubbing at her skin, only to smear the glow further. Mark stormed toward the back door, David's back door. He banged on it, fists tight. "What the hell did you do?" David didn't answer right away. He let the moment sit, let Mark stew in the panic. Then he picked up his phone and sent a single text. "Nice swim. Hope you enjoy the glow. It lasts 48 hours. Mark looked at his phone, then back at the pool, his face twisted with realization. David could hear Lisa's voice behind him. "You idiot! I told you not to keep doing this." Mark ignored her and turned back to David's house. "Open the damn door, David." David finally responded. He opened the blinds just enough to make eye contact. Then, with the calmest voice possible, he said, "You should have asked." And then he shut the blinds. Mark stood there for a moment, fists clenched, completely out of words, his face, his arms, even his chest, still glowing. Lisa grabbed his sleeve. "Let's go now." They left in a hurry, shoving through the side gate. David sat down on his couch, stretched his legs out, and let out a satisfied breath. His pool was finally his again. David sat back on his couch, his laptop open, watching the scene unfold in real time. The security footage showed them scrambling through the yard, stumbling over lounge chairs, their glowing bodies practically lighting up the night like eerie neon specters. Lisa was furiously rubbing her arms, but the dye wasn't coming off. One of the teenagers had bolted to the outdoor shower, frantically scrubbing at his skin while muttering a string of panicked curses. The other stood near the pool steps, staring at his own hands like he'd been cursed. Mark, however, was the loudest. "What the hell is this?" he bellowed, standing near the patio light, his arms outstretched like some kind of radioactive mutant. His entire chest, shoulders, and face glowed with a sickly green hue. The water droplets on his skin only amplified the effect. Lisa turned on him, still trying to rub the color off. "I told you we shouldn't keep doing this." "I didn't think he'd..." Mark started, but he cut himself off when his eyes caught something through the sliding glass door. David sitting comfortably watching them. David had his phone in hand, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He casually lifted it and typed out another message. Mark's phone buzzed. He yanked it out of his pocket and read, "It's non-toxic, won't hurt you, but it's not coming off any time soon. Have fun explaining this tomorrow." Mark let out a frustrated growl, his fists clenched at his sides. But what could he do? Call the police? That would only mean admitting that he'd been trespassing. Go inside and scrub? Pointless. The dye was designed to bond with the skin underwater. It would take a full 48 hours before it naturally faded. David could hear Lisa muttering something about work the next day. Her voice had gone from angry to anxious. Mark's job involved meeting clients face to face. One of the teenagers groaned, "Dude, I have a date tomorrow. I can't show up looking like a freaking alien." David had to bite back a laugh. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the gate. "We're leaving now." They moved quickly, slipping back into the night, their glowing arms and legs giving them away even in the dark. As soon as the side gate slammed shut behind them, David finally let out the laugh he had been holding in. He closed his laptop, stretched his arms, and felt the deepest sense of satisfaction. His pool was his again. But he wasn't done just yet. He had one last thing to do. David opened the neighborhood's private community group chat and, without naming names, wrote a simple message. Friendly reminder, if you're going to borrow someone's pool, make sure you don't leave glowing evidence. David woke up the next morning feeling well rested for the first time in weeks. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing his pool was now off limits to the people who had been sneaking in like it was their personal retreat. Still in his pajamas, he grabbed a cup of coffee and stepped onto his porch. The Arizona sun had barely risen, but it was already warming the neighborhood. David leaned against the railing, sipping his drink, waiting. And sure enough, he didn't have to wait long. Mark and Lisa's front door swung open. Mark stepped out first, wearing a hoodie, sunglasses, and long sweatpants, which would have been fine if it wasn't already 85 degrees outside. Lisa followed, wrapped in a scarf that barely hid the faint green tint still clinging to her skin. Their teenage sons weren't as lucky. One of them shuffled to the car in a full tracksuit, his face hidden behind the hood. The other had on what looked like gloves, desperate attempts to cover up the glowing evidence. But even from where David stood, he could still see traces of neon green peeking from the edges of their clothes. David took a long, slow sip of his coffee. They knew he was watching. Lisa shot a quick glance toward David's house, her jaw tight. Mark, however, kept his head down, yanking his car door open with a little too much force. The teenagers muttered something between them before piling into the back seat. The best part? David had already overheard one of his other neighbors talking about them that morning. "Did you see them? They're glowing," someone had whispered while walking their dog. Another neighbor had laughed. "I thought they just got a bad spray tan." Mark knew, Lisa knew, the whole street was talking about it. And David, he didn't even have to say a word. But that didn't mean he was finished just yet. His phone buzzed, a text from Mark. "Mark, you've made your point." David smirked. He took his time before replying. "David, did I? Because I don't remember breaking into someone else's backyard." 3 dots appeared on the screen, then disappeared. No response. David took another sip of coffee, enjoying the silence. Good. That night, David checked his security cameras one last time. The side gate remained shut. No shadows moving in the dark, no splashes, no laughter, just the still, untouched water of his own pool. Lesson learned. David didn't hear a single word from Mark or Lisa for the next few days. No half-hearted apologies, no excuses, just silence. Honestly, that was fine by him. The neighborhood, however, had plenty to say. Words spread quickly. Some people thought the whole thing was hilarious. Others just shook their heads, muttering about entitlement. A few even sent David private messages congratulating him for handling the situation without getting the HOA or police involved. But the best part? A few days later, David was out watering his front yard when one of his other neighbors, Mrs. Ruiz, an older woman who had lived on the street for decades, walked by with her dog. She stopped, adjusted her sunglasses, and smirked. "You know, back in my day, people at least had the decency to ask before acting like they owned someone else's property," she said casually. David chuckled. "Guess some people need a little help understanding boundaries." Mrs. Ruiz just shook her head. "Well, you sure gave them a bright reminder." Then, as she started to walk off, she added, "Oh, and I hope they enjoy explaining that to their boss and teachers." David smiled as he turned back to his yard. That was the thing about people like Mark and Lisa. They never thought about the consequences of their actions until it was too late. Some folks assume they can take what they want, that they can bend the rules because it's convenient for them. But the moment they face real consequences, they play the victim. David didn't need a shouting match or legal threats to make his point. He let reality do the talking, and it worked. From that day forward, his pool remained his. The side gate stayed shut, the water undisturbed. Mark and Lisa never spoke of it, and neither did David. They knew he knew, and that was enough. But here's the real takeaway. Some people won't respect boundaries until they're forced to. But that doesn't mean you have to stoop to their level. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, it's creativity. So tell me, was David's prank justified, or should he have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this story, make sure to subscribe for more crazy real-life tales.